Sometimes the weight of our past becomes so heavy that we choose to disappear from the world entirely. We tell ourselves it's better this way, safer for everyone if we just fade into the wilderness and let time heal what we've broken. Eirik Thorsson had lived this way for 10 winters. The once mighty Viking warrior had retreated to a small cabin deep in the Scandinavian forests, far from civilization and the memories that haunted him. His days were spent chopping wood and tending a small fire. His nights were filled with silence and regret. But on one bitter winter evening, everything changed. Through the howling snow came a young woman, barely alive, seeking shelter at his door. Her name was Signe, and she carried wounds that matched the scars on his own soul. What brought her to his threshold would force this broken man to face the very demons he'd spent a decade trying to forget. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wooden prayer beads slipped through Eirik's calloused fingers like water, worn smooth by a decade of anxious handling. Each bead represented a prayer he'd once believed in, words whispered to gods who seemed to have turned their backs on him long ago. The string had broken and been retied so many times that it bore more knots than beads, much like the man who held it. Dawn crept through the gaps in his timber cabin walls, casting long shadows across the single room that had become his entire world. The space was sparse but functional. A stone hearth dominated one wall, its embers still glowing from the previous night's fire. A simple wooden table sat beneath the only window, scarred from years of use as both workspace and dining surface. A narrow bed occupied the far corner, its straw mattress lumpy but adequate. Pelts hung from wooden pegs, driven into the walls, fox and wolf mostly, their warmth more precious than gold in this unforgiving climate. Eirik rose from his bed, his joints protesting the movement with the familiar ache of a man who had seen 50 winters. His grey-streaked beard reached nearly to his chest, unkempt but clean. The same could be said for his hair, which hung past his shoulders in the style of his people, though silver now outnumbered the original brown. His frame remained powerful despite the years of solitude, broad shoulders and thick arms testament to the warrior he had once been. But his eyes told a different story. Pale blue depths that held the weight of unspeakable loss. The rusted battle axe leaned against the hearth where he'd left it the night before. Once, this weapon had been his constant companion, its blade polished to mirror brightness, its edge sharp enough to cleave through bone and steel alike. Now it served a humbler purpose, splitting firewood and felling trees for his modest needs. The irony wasn't lost on him. A tool of war had become an instrument of survival, much like the man who wielded it. His morning routine never varied. First, he would stoke the fire back to life, adding dry kindling until flames danced eagerly in the hearth. Then he would dress in his simple wool tunic and leather breeches, both mended countless times, but still serviceable. A thick cloak of wolf fur completed his daily armor against the cold. Finally, he would check his traps and tend to his small store of provisions. But this morning felt different. The young woman lay unconscious on his bed, her breathing shallow, but steady. In the pale dawn light, he could see the full extent of her injuries. Bruises covered her arms in the distinct pattern of brutal hands. Her feet were torn and bloodied from running barefoot through the forest. Most troubling were the marks around her throat, finger-shaped bruises that spoke of attempted strangulation. She was perhaps 25 summers, with the fair hair and pale skin of Norse nobility, but her hands were calloused from hard labor, and her thin frame spoke of meager meals and harsh treatment. Whatever her birth, she had lived as a thrall for some time. The torn remnants of her dress confirmed this, rough-spun wool of the sort given to slaves, not the fine fabrics of a free woman. Eirik found himself studying her face, searching for clues to her identity. Even in unconsciousness, pain creased her features. She muttered words he couldn't quite make out, fragments of what sounded like names and places. Once, she cried out in terror, her body thrashing as nightmare visions played behind her closed eyelids. Memory struck him like a physical blow. Another woman, another time. Astrid had looked much the same when fever had claimed her, though her face had been marked by love and laughter rather than violence. His wife had died in this very bed. Her hand clutched in his as their unborn child died with her. Their son, barely 8 winters old, had followed within days. The same sickness that took his mother, proving too much for his small body. That had been the beginning of the end for Eirik Thorsson. After the burials, after the tears had dried and the mourning period had passed, he had thrown himself into battle with reckless abandon. No enemy was too dangerous, no odds too steep. He courted death in every conflict, seeking to join his family in whatever afterlife awaited them. But death, it seemed, had no interest in claiming him. Instead, he had become something worse than dead. He had become a monster. Without the anchor of love to guide him, his warrior's skill had twisted into something dark and merciless. He took no prisoners, showed no quarter, killed not just enemies, but anyone who stood in his way. Other warriors began to fear him, not for his courage, but for his cruelty. Children would hide when he passed through villages. Women would cross themselves and mutter prayers. The final straw had come during a raid on a Saxon settlement. A small, farming village, barely defended, had fallen quickly to their war band. Standard practice would have been to take what they could carry and leave the survivors to rebuild. But Eirik, lost in his rage and grief, had ordered the entire village burned. Men, women, children, all had perished in the flames while he stood watching, deaf to their screams. His own men had finally turned against him, not in battle, but in shame. His childhood friend Olaf, who had fought beside him for 20 years, had struck him down with the pommel of his sword and left him bleeding in the ashes of his atrocity. "You are no longer the man I knew," Olaf had said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "Find your way back to honor, or die forgotten in the wilderness. Either way, never darken our halls again." So Eirik had chosen exile. He'd gathered what few possessions remained to him and walked into the deep forest, seeking a place far enough from civilization that his darkness could harm no one else. This cabin had been built with his own hands, log by log, a monument to his shame and his determination to become something other than the monster he had been. For 10 years, he had lived in this self-imposed prison. He hunted for food, trapped for furs to trade when his few supplies ran low. He spoke to no one except the occasional trader who ventured this deep into the woods, and those conversations were brief and purely transactional. He read the same handful of books until the words were burned into his memory. He carved simple wooden objects, cups, bowls, spoons, more for something to occupy his hands than from any need, and every night he held those prayer beads and tried to find his way back to the gods he had abandoned or who had abandoned him. The prayers felt hollow in his mouth, meaningless syllables that echoed off the cabin walls and died in the silence. Yet he continued the ritual, hoping that somewhere in the repetition he might find the peace that had eluded him. The woman stirred, drawing his attention back to the present. Her eyes fluttered open, pale green like sea glass, and immediately filled with terror. She tried to sit up, to flee, but her injuries made her gasp in pain. "Peace," Eirik said softly, raising his hands, to show he meant no harm. "You are safe here." She stared at him, taking in his size, his rough appearance, the weapons hanging on his walls. Her breathing came in quick, panicked gasps, like a trapped animal seeking escape. "I will not hurt you," he continued, keeping his voice gentle despite its natural roughness. "You came to my door near death. I brought you inside to tend your wounds. Where—" Her voice was barely a whisper, raw from whatever screaming had damaged her throat. "Where am I?" "Deep in the Nordmark forest, about 2 days' walk from the nearest settlement. My name is Eirik." He paused, then added, "You are free to leave whenever you wish, but I would counsel against it until you have healed." She tried again to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at her injuries. Eirik moved to help her, but she flinched away from his touch. The fear in her eyes cut, deeper than any blade. "I understand," he said, settling back on his stool by the fire. "Trust must be earned, especially for one who has suffered as you clearly have." Her gaze fell on the prayer beads in his hands, and something in her expression shifted. Recognition, perhaps, or memory of better times, when such symbols meant comfort rather than empty ritual. "What is your name?" he asked gently. She hesitated, as if even that simple information might be dangerous to share. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Signe, Signe," he repeated, tasting the name. It meant victory, though. What victory this broken young woman might claim was unclear. "Are you hungry? I have porridge warming and clean water." She nodded, not trusting her voice. As Eirik ladled the simple meal into a wooden bowl, he caught her watching his movements with the wariness of someone who had learned that kindness could be a prelude to cruelty. How many times, he wondered, had she been offered food only to have it snatched away, or given comfort only to pay for it with pain? The bowl shook in her hands as she tried to eat, exhaustion and fear making her movements clumsy. Eirik pretended not to notice, busying himself with banking the fire and checking his simple provisions. He gave her space, let her set the pace of any conversation. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, and snow continued to fall. Whatever had driven Signe to his door in the middle of a winter storm, whatever horrors she had fled, they would have to wait. For now, she was safe in this small refuge he had built from his guilt and determination. But safety, Eirik knew from hard experience, was often a temporary gift. The world had a way of finding those who tried to hide from it, and the darkness that hunted this young woman would not be easily discouraged. As if summoned by his thoughts, Signe looked up from her bowl, her green eyes meeting his across the small space of the cabin. "They will come for me," she whispered, and in those 4 words, Eirik heard the echo of his own dark past, calling him back to a life he had tried so desperately to leave behind. The torn thrall collar lay on the wooden table like a serpent made of iron, its broken chain links catching the firelight. Signe stared at it with a mixture of revulsion and relief, her fingers unconsciously rubbing the raw marks it had left around her throat. The metal bore intricate engravings, not the simple bands given to ordinary slaves, but the ornate collar of a high-born thrall, someone kept for more than just labor. "I threw it off during my escape," she said, her voice stronger now after 2 days of rest and nourishment. "I never want to feel its weight again." Eirik examined the collar without touching it, noting the craftsmanship and the crest worked into the metal. A raven clutching a sword, the mark of Jarl Magnus Bloodaxe, a name that carried weight even in his exile. Magnus was known throughout the Northlands as a man of cruel appetites and unlimited ambition, the sort of leader who expanded his territory through treachery rather than honest conquest. "Magnus," Eirik said, and watched Signe flinch at the name. "I know of him. His reputation reaches even into these woods." Signe pulled the borrowed cloak tighter around her shoulders. Eirik had given her one of his own tunics and a pair of wool leggings, both far too large but clean and warm. The transformation from the half-dead woman who had stumbled to his door was remarkable, but the fear in her eyes remained constant. "You have to understand," she began, then stopped, as if gathering courage for what came next. "What I saw, what I escaped from, it will sound like madness. I have seen enough madness in my years to know it when I hear it," Eirik replied. "Speak freely." Signe nodded, her gaze drifting to the fire as if the flames might make her words easier to bear. 3 nights ago, Magnus held a great feast in his hall. He had invited Jarl Eirik Grimson and his retinue under the banner of peace. They were to discuss territorial boundaries and trade agreements. I was serving at the high table, as I often did. She paused, her hands trembling slightly. Eirik waited, recognizing the need to let painful memories emerge at their own pace. Eirik came with only a small guard, perhaps a dozen men. He trusted in the sacred laws of hospitality, in the oaths Magnus had sworn before the gods. We all did. Her voice grew bitter. But Magnus had prepared for treachery. He had hidden armed men throughout the hall, disguised as servants and entertainers. Eirik felt a familiar chill, the same cold that had once preceded his own darkest moments. What happened? The signal was a horn blast, short and sharp. Suddenly, every servant in the hall drew steel. Eirik's men were outnumbered 5-1, caught completely off guard. It was slaughter, not battle. Tears began to flow down her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. I watched Magnus himself drive a spear through Eirik's back as the old Jarl tried to reach his fallen sword. The brutality of it struck Eirik like a physical blow. To murder guests under one's own roof was among the most heinous crimes a leader could commit, a violation of every sacred law that bound their society together. No gods would smile on such treachery, no skalds would sing songs of such dishonor. But why kill you for witnessing it? Eirik asked. Thralls see many things their masters prefer forgotten. Signe's laugh was harsh, devoid of humor. Because I'm not just any thrall. Because my true name is not simply Signe, but Signe Eiriksdottir. She met his eyes, and he saw the pain of a daughter who had watched her father die. Eirik Grimson was my father. The revelation hit Eirik like a war. Hammer to the chest. Suddenly everything made sense. Her noble bearing, her refined speech, the ornate collar that marked her as no ordinary slave. But it also meant something far more dangerous than he had imagined. Magnus made you watch your father's murder, he said, the words heavy with understanding. Worse, he made me serve the wine that evening, knowing what was to come. I poured drinks for my father's killers, smiled when they toasted their friendship, all while Magnus watched me with those cold eyes of his. Her voice broke slightly. He wanted me to know that I was completely powerless, that I could do nothing to save the man who gave me life. Eirik stood and began pacing the small confines of his cabin, his mind racing through the implications. If Signe was truly Eirik's daughter, then she was the rightful heir to significant lands and wealth. More importantly, she was a living witness to Magnus's treachery, evidence that could turn every neighboring jarl against him if she lived to tell her tale. After the slaughter, Signe continued, Magnus announced that he was claiming my father's lands by right of conquest. He said Eirik had attacked him first, that he had acted in self-defense. The surviving witnesses were all his own men, of course, who would contradict their jarl's version of events. But you knew the truth. I knew, and he knew that I knew. That same night he came to the slave quarters where I had been kept for 3 years. He told me that I would serve a new purpose now, as entertainment for him and his most trusted men. That I would learn to be grateful for his mercy in keeping me alive. The rage that filled Eirik was swift and familiar, the same burning anger that had once driven him to terrible acts. But this time it was tempered by something he had almost forgotten, the desire to protect rather than destroy. How did you escape? By the gods' grace and my own desperation. Magnus had drunk heavily at the feast, celebrating his victory. When he came for me, he was stumbling drunk and overconfident. I had hidden a small eating knife, stolen from the kitchens. She stopped, unable to continue. You defended yourself, Eirik said gently. There is no shame in that. I cut him, not deeply, but enough to make him roar like a wounded bear. In his rage and pain, he gave me the opening I needed. I ran. She touched her throat where the collar had been. I tore this cursed thing off as I fled into the forest. I've been running ever since, afraid to stop, afraid to think about where I was going. Eirik understood now why she had appeared at his door in such a state. 3 days of running through winter woods with no food, no shelter, no destination except away would test anyone's endurance. That she had survived at all spoke to a strength that her fragile appearance belied "Magnus will not let this stand," he said, voicing what they both knew. "You injured him, escaped his control, and carry knowledge that could destroy him. He will hunt you to the ends of the earth." "I know." Her voice was small but resolute. "That's why I wanted to warn you. Being near me puts you in danger. I should leave as soon as I'm able to travel." Eirik stopped pacing and turned to face her. The woman before him was no longer just a stranger seeking shelter. She was Eirik Grimson's daughter, sole survivor of a massacre, rightful heir to stolen lands. But more than that, she was someone who had suffered as he had suffered, who carried wounds that matched his own. "Where would you go?" he asked. The question hung in the air between them. Signe had no answer because there was no good answer. Every Jarl in the region would have heard Magnus's version of events by now. Without proof of his treachery, her word as a thrall, for that was how the world saw her now, would carry little weight against his. "I don't know," she admitted. "Perhaps to my mother's kin across the sea, if I could find passage. Or maybe to one of the Christian monasteries. They sometimes give sanctuary to those in need." Both options were desperate measures with little chance of success. A woman alone, with no resources and powerful enemies, would be lucky to survive. The journey to any potential haven. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the pines, like the voices of the dead demanding justice. But beneath that natural sound, Eirik heard something else, something that made his warrior instincts stir after years of dormancy. Hoofbeats. He moved to the window, peering through the gaps in the shutters into the swirling snow. There, perhaps. A mile distant, he could see the faint glow of torches moving through the forest. Riders, and not just one or two. A full search party, methodically combing the woods. "They've found our trail," he said quietly. Signe's face went white. "How many?" "Hard to tell in this snow, but at least a dozen, maybe more." Eirik turned from the window, his mind already shifting into the tactical thinking that had once made him one of the most feared warriors in the Northlands. "They'll be here within the hour. Then I have to run. Right now. Before—" "No." The word came out harder than he intended, carrying an authority he hadn't used in years. "You're still weak from your ordeal. In this storm you'd be dead within a mile. Then what do you suggest?" Fear made her voice sharp. "They'll kill us both. If they find me here." Eirik looked at the thrall collar on his table, then at the young woman who had worn it, who had watched her father die and suffered indignities that would have broken a lesser spirit. He thought of his own daughter, who would have been near. Signe's age if she had lived. He thought of the monster he had become and the man he was trying to be. "We fight," he said simply. "Fight. There are at least 12 of them, and you're just one man. I was never just one man in battle." Eirik moved to the wall where his weapons hung, pulling down the rusted axe and testing its weight. "And you are Eirik Grimson's daughter. That blood doesn't run from tyranny, it stands against it." For the first time since she had spoken her father's name, something other than fear flickered in Signe's eyes. Something that might have been hope, or determination, or the ember of a rage that had been buried under suffering, but never truly extinguished. "You would risk your life for me? Why?" Eirik considered the question as he began checking his other weapons, a sword that hadn't tasted blood in a decade, a seax knife that had served him well in close quarters, a bow with a quiver of arrows that might still fly true. Why indeed? Perhaps because he recognized something of himself in her pain. Perhaps because the thought of Magnus's men taking her back to face whatever horrors awaited her was unbearable. Or perhaps because for the first time in 10 years he had found something worth fighting for that wasn't born from rage or despair. "Because some things are worth the risk," he said finally. "And because I've spent too many years running from who I used to be. Maybe it's time to remember that being a warrior doesn't have to mean being a monster." Outside, the hoofbeats grew closer, and the glow of torches became brighter against the snow-laden sky. Magnus's men were coming, and they would find Eirik. Thorsson waiting for them. Not the broken exile who had hidden in these woods for a decade, but the warrior he had been before grief and guilt had twisted his purpose. The thrall collar caught the firelight one last time before Eirik swept it into the flames, where it began to glow cherry red as the metal heated. The symbol of Signe's bondage would burn tonight, and if the gods were willing, so would the men who had forged it. The small leather pouch felt heavy in Eirik's hands, weighted with more than just the dried herbs and roots it contained. His mother's teachings came flooding back as he carefully sorted through the contents. Willow bark for pain, comfrey for wounds, feverfew for headaches. She had been a healer before she was a warrior's wife, and she had passed that knowledge to her son alongside. Lessons in sword work and strategy. "Your hands were made for more than killing," she had told him once, watching as he ground dried elderflower into powder. "Remember that, my son. A true warrior knows when to heal and when to harm." If only he had remembered those words during his darkest years. Instead, he had become exactly what she had feared, a man who knew only destruction, who had forgotten the gentle touch that could mend as easily as destroy. Now, as he prepared a poultice for Signe's injuries, those long buried, memories guided his movements. The familiar rhythm of mixing herbs and binding wounds felt strange after so many years, like speaking a language he had almost forgotten. "This will help with the pain," he said softly, approaching where Signe sat on the edge of his bed. She had insisted on staying upright despite her exhaustion, too wary to let her guard down completely. She watched his hands as he worked, noting the surprising gentleness in his movements. "You know the healing arts? My mother taught me long ago. She said a man who could only destroy was only half a man." He applied the poultice to the worst of her bruises with careful precision. "I had forgotten that wisdom for many years." Signe studied his weathered face as he worked. "What happened to make you forget?" The question hung between them like morning mist, delicate and easily dispersed. Eirik paused in his ministrations, his hands stilling as memories he had tried. Duberry threatened to surface. "I lost what mattered most to me," he said finally, "and I let that loss turn me into something my mother would not have recognized. Your family, my wife Astrid, our son Bjorn, and our unborn child." The words came out quietly, as if speaking them too loudly might summon fresh pain. "A fever took them all within days of each other. I was away on a trading expedition, thought I was providing for them. Instead, I was absent when they needed me most." Signe's expression softened with understanding. "Grief can make monsters of us all, some of us more than others." Eirik resumed his work, but his movements were more careful. Now, as if tending her wounds might somehow atone for past failures. "After they died, I threw myself into battle. I told myself I was seeking an honorable death, but the truth was darker. I was seeking to make the world feel the pain I carried." As he spoke, he told her about the years that followed, the gradual erosion of his honor, the way violence had become his only language, the final atrocity that had driven his own men to cast him out. Signe listened without judgment, her green eyes reflecting a pain that matched his own. "And then you came here," she said when he finished. "I came here to die slowly rather than in battle. I thought isolation was a kind of penance, that if I harmed no one else, I might find some measure of peace." He tied off the bandage he had wrapped around her torn feet. "But peace, it seems, is not so easily earned." Outside, the sound of hoofbeats had grown closer. Through the shuttered windows, they could see the orange glow of torches cutting through the falling snow. Magnus's men were perhaps half a mile away now, close enough that they could hear the occasional shout or the whinny of horses. "Tell me about your life before," Eirik said, finishing his work and settling back on his stool. "Before Magnus, before you became his thrall. What was it like being Eirik Grimson's daughter?" A ghost of a smile touched Signe's lips, the first genuine expression of joy he had seen from her. "I was happy. My father was stern but fair, and he loved me deeply, despite my mother's early death." He taught me letters and numbers, things most daughters of Jarls never learn. He said intelligence was a weapon that no enemy could take from me. Wise words. He was planning to arrange a marriage for me, not for political gain, but to a man he thought would treat me well. Thorvald Eriksson, a young Jarl from across the fjord. We had met several times, and I thought I could learn to love him. Her voice grew sad. That was all before Magnus's raids began, before my father's lands became a target. How did you become his thrall? A captured enemy's daughter has value, she said bitterly. Magnus could have killed me when he first took my father's outer settlements, but I was worth more alive. He paraded me before his men as proof of his victory, then put me to work in his kitchens. For 3 years I scrubbed his floors and served his table, watching him feast on the wealth he had stolen from my people. Eirik found his hands clenching into fists at the thought of this woman, this daughter of a Jarl, being reduced to such circumstances. The rage was building again, but this time it felt different, cleaner somehow. Not the wild fury that had once consumed him, but something more focused, more purposeful. He kept you close because he enjoyed your suffering, Eirik observed. Every day he would remind me of my fallen station. Look how low the mighty have fallen, he would say. Your father's pride brought him nothing but death, and you nothing but chains. Signe's voice hardened. But he underestimated me. I watched. Everything, learned everything. I know his habits, his weaknesses, the layout of his hall, the loyalty of his men. And you learned to endure. I learned to survive. There's a difference. She met his eyes directly. I never stopped planning my escape, never stopped hoping for the chance to see him pay for what he did to my family. The torches outside were close enough now that they could hear individual voices calling to each other through the storm, commands to spread out, to check every tree, every possible hiding place. They had perhaps minutes before the search party reached the cabin. Can you walk? Eirik asked, moving to gather his weapons. Signe tested her weight on her bandaged feet, wincing but managing to stand. Well enough. Then we need to prepare. He handed her his seax knife, noting how naturally her fingers found the proper grip. Your father taught you to fight? Basic knife work, nothing more. He said it was unseemly for a woman to learn the sword, but that any person should be able to defend themselves if cornered. A fierce light entered her eyes. I think he would approve of the circumstances. Eirik found himself smiling, truly smiling, for the first time in years. Here was a woman who had endured 3 years of degradation and abuse, who had watched her father die and her inheritance stolen, yet still carried fire in her heart. Eirik Grimson had raised his daughter well. There's a root cellar beneath the cabin, he said, pulling back a section of the floor to reveal a hidden space. It's well concealed and stocked with supplies. If things go badly, no. Signe's voice was firm. I will not hide while you face them alone. We stand together or not at all. Something shifted in Eirik's chest at her words, a feeling he had thought lost forever. Not love, it was too soon for that, but recognition, kinship, the understanding that comes when two damaged souls find something worth protecting in each other. Together then, he said, and meant it. The sound of hoofbeats stopped outside his door. The carved wooden cup sat between them on the small table, steam rising from the warm mead within. Eirik had fashioned it years ago during one of his longest winters, when the isolation had driven him to carve and whittle, just to keep his hands busy and his mind from dwelling on darker thoughts. Now, watching Signe's fingers wrap around its simple curves, he realized it had been meant for this moment, to be shared, to provide comfort to someone other than himself. It's beautiful work, she said, admiring the intricate knotwork pattern he had carved around the rim. You have skilled hands for more than warfare and healing. Idle hands are the devil's workshop, my mother used to say, though I suspect she meant something different than spending years carving trinkets in exile. Eirik settled across from her, noting how the warm drink and rest had brought color back to her pale cheeks. It helped pass the time when the silence became too heavy. They had been talking for hours since the immediate danger passed. Magnus's men had swept through the area but missed the cabin, their torches passing by in the night, like lost spirits searching for the living. The storm had covered their tracks and muffled any sounds from within, providing a reprieve that both I knew was temporary. "Tell me about the silence," Signe said softly. "What was it like living alone for so long?" Eirik considered the question, surprised by his willingness to share what he had never spoken aloud. At first it was a relief. No voices demanding violence, no commands to march or raid or kill, just the sound of wind in the trees and my own breathing. He paused, remembering. But silence has weight, especially when it carries the voices of those you've lost. After a while, I found myself talking to Astrid and Bjorn as if they were still here. Mad, perhaps, but it kept some part of them alive. "Not mad," Signe said with gentle certainty. "I spoke to my father every day during my captivity, sometimes in anger, sometimes in sorrow, but always with love. The dead don't truly leave us while we remember them." Their conversation had revealed layers to each other that the crisis of her arrival had not allowed. Signe spoke of her childhood with a father who'd been both warrior and scholar, who had encouraged her questions and treated her more like the son he'd never had than a traditional daughter. She described long evenings by the fire in her father's hall, listening to scolds recite the old stories while she worked at her embroidery. He used to say that wisdom without courage was worthless, but courage without wisdom was dangerous. She continued, sharing the cup between them in the old tradition of hospitality. "I think he would have liked you, despite your dark years. He always said that a man's true nature shows not in his victories, but in how he rises from his defeats." "And what do you think my true nature is?" Eirik asked, surprised by how much her answer mattered to him. Signe studied his face in the firelight, taking in the scars and weathered features, the eyes that held both gentle kindness and barely contained violence. "I think you are a man who has paid for his mistakes with years of self-imposed suffering. I think you chose exile not because you were weak, but because you were strong enough to recognize the monster you had become." She paused, then added quietly, "And I think you have been alone long enough." A sound escaped Eirik then, not quite. A laugh, not quite a sob, but something that spoke of years of buried emotion finding unexpected release. When had anyone last spoken to him with such understanding? When had he last felt seen rather than feared? "What about you?" he asked. "What is your true nature, Signe, Eirik's daughter?" "I don't know anymore," she admitted. "For 3 years, I have been Signe the thrall, Signe the serving girl, Signe the victim. I learned to make myself small, to speak only when spoken to endure whatever was demanded of me. But sitting here with you, sharing this cup, I remember glimpses of who I used to be." "And who was that?" "Someone who laughed easily. Someone who asked too many questions and gave her opinion whether it was wanted or not. Someone who believed that justice existed and that good would triumph over evil if brave people stood up for what was right." She smiled ruefully. "Naive, perhaps, but I miss that certainty." "Naivety and hope are not the same thing," Eirik observed. "One can be lost through experience, but the other is a choice we make each day." Their fingers brushed as they both reached for the cup at the same moment, and neither pulled away. The contact was electric, charged with an intimacy that went beyond the mere sharing of warmth. For Eirik, it was the first willing human touch he had experienced in a decade. For Signe, it was the first touch that offered comfort rather than pain. "I'm frightened," she whispered, though whether of Magnus's pursuit or of this growing connection between them, she didn't say. "So am I," he replied honestly. "It has been so long since I had anything to lose that I had forgotten what fear felt like." Outside, the storm was beginning to subside, though snow still fell steadily. The reprieve Magnus's men had been granted by the weather would not last much longer, and they both knew it. Come morning, the search would resume with greater intensity. We cannot stay here," Eirik said reluctantly. "This place has been my sanctuary, but it will become our tomb if we remain. Where can we go? Magnus has men throughout the region, and my face is known to many of them. Deeper into the wilderness. I know places where even the most determined hunters rarely venture. Caves, hidden valleys, paths that exist only for those who know how to read the land." He squeezed her hand gently. "We buy time while we decide our next move. What if there is no next move? What if all we can do is run until we're too tired to run anymore?" Eirik was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if it might hold answers to impossible questions. Finally, he spoke with a conviction that surprised them both. "Then we make our stand somewhere that matters. Your father's death demands justice, and you are the only one who can provide it. Running may keep us alive, but living requires more than mere survival." Signe's grip on his hand tightened. "You would help me seek justice against Magnus, even though it would mean abandoning this sanctuary you've built?" This was never truly a sanctuary, Eirik realized aloud. It was a prison I built for myself, and I have served my sentence. Perhaps it's time to remember that redemption is not found in isolation, but in service to something greater than our own pain. For the first time since her arrival, Signe truly smiled. Not the ghost of happiness she had shown before, but something radiant and transformative. In that smile, Eirik caught a glimpse of the woman she had been before Magnus's cruelty had dimmed her light, and perhaps a vision of who she might become again. "Together then," she said, echoing his words from earlier. "Whatever comes, we face it together." "Together," he agreed, and felt something long dead stirring to life in his chest. Not just desire or affection, but purpose. For the first time in 10 years, Eirik Thorsson had something worth fighting for that was not born from rage or vengeance, but from hope and the possibility of a future neither of them had dared to imagine. The cup passed between them one final time as they made their plans, and in its simple sharing they forged a bond that would be tested by the trials ahead, but never broken. The storm outside might be subsiding, but the tempest of their joined destinies was just beginning. The stone cooking pot had seen better days, its surface blackened from years of use over open fires. But it held heat well, and had never cracked despite countless winters of freezing and thawing. As Eirik stirred the simple stew within, rabbit he had snared, wild onions and dried berries, he reflected on how something so mundane had become precious through the simple act of sharing it with another person. They had been traveling for 3 days since leaving the cabin, moving through terrain that would challenge even experienced woodsmen. Eirik led them along paths that existed more in his memory than on the ground, following deer trails and creek beds, always staying away from the established routes that Magnus's searchers would favor. The morning had started like the others. Breaking camp before dawn, sharing a cold meal of dried meat and hardtack, then moving through the forest with the careful patience of hunted animals. But this morning had brought an encounter that changed everything. The scout had appeared suddenly from behind a large pine, young and overconfident, probably sent ahead of the main search party to check this remote valley. He had spotted them. From perhaps 50 yards away, his hand already moving to the horn at his belt that would summon his companions. Eirik had moved without conscious thought, decades of warrior training overriding years of peaceful isolation. The throwing knife had left his hand in one smooth motion, taking the scout in the throat before he could sound the alarm. The young man had fallen silently, his message undelivered, his horn unused. But Signe had seen it all. "You moved like death." "Itself," she said now, watching him tend the fire beneath the cooking pot. They had taken shelter in a small cave, well hidden from any search parties. But the memory of that morning's violence hung between them like smoke. "I warned you that. I was once something other than a hermit," Eirik replied, though he couldn't meet her eyes. "Some skills once learned are never truly forgotten. I'm not condemning you. That man would have brought Magnus's entire force down on us." Signe stirred the stew with a carved wooden spoon. another of Eirik's simple creations. But watching you kill him, seeing how naturally it came to you, it reminded me that violence lives in you still. Eirik finally looked at her, seeing not fear in her expression, but something more complex, a mixture of gratitude, concern, and perhaps a flicker of something that might have been attraction to the deadly competence he had displayed. Does that frighten you? Yes, she said honestly, but not in the way you might think. It frightens me because I found myself impressed. For 3 years, I watched violent men use their strength to hurt and control. But when you killed that scout, you were protecting, rather than predating. There's a difference, and part of me is ashamed that I can see beauty in such deadly skill. They ate in contemplative silence for a while, both wrestling with the implications of what had occurred. The simple act of sharing a meal from the stone pot, something Eirik had done alone for so many years, felt different now that violence had returned to his life. The pot that had once contained only his own meager sustenance now held food that would nourish them both for whatever battles lay ahead. "Tell me about the man you killed," Signe said eventually. "What did you see in his face?" Eirik considered the question carefully. In his darkest years, he had rarely looked at his victims as individuals. They had been obstacles to be removed, enemies to be destroyed. But this morning had been different. Young, perhaps 18 winters. Eager to prove himself, probably. Hoping to be the one who captured the famous fugitive. He paused. "I saw myself at that age, full of certainty about right and wrong, believing that strength and skill were all that mattered. Do you regret it? I regret the necessity of it. But I cannot regret protecting you." The words came out with surprising firmness. "That troubles me more than the killing itself. How easily I chose your safety over his life." Signe set down her spoon and looked at him directly. "Is that so wrong? To value the life of someone who matters to you over that of someone who would see you dead or captured?" "It's the beginning of how good men become monsters," Eirik said quietly. "We start by protecting those we love, but eventually we're killing anyone who inconveniences us. The line between justified violence and unnecessary cruelty can be thinner than a blade's edge. But you see the line now. That makes all the difference." Their conversation was interrupted by sounds from outside the cave. Not the approach of searchers, but something else. Hoofbeats again, but fewer than before, and moving with purpose rather than the random patterns of a search party. Eirik moved to the cave mouth, peering carefully through the undergrowth that concealed their hiding place. What he saw made his blood run cold. Magnus himself rode at the head of a small group, perhaps 8 men, all mounted and heavily armed. The Jarl was unmistakable, even at a distance, massive in build, with iron-grey hair and a beard braided with silver rings. A fresh bandage covered one side of his neck where Signe's knife had found its mark, and his face bore the cold fury of a man accustomed to absolute obedience who had been defied. "He's here," Eirik whispered, motioning for Signe to join him at the cave mouth. She crept forward, and when she saw Magnus, her entire body went rigid. Even from their concealed position, the man's presence seemed to fill the valley with menace. This was no mere search party led by subordinates. This was the wolf himself, hunting for the prey that had dared to wound him. "He must have found the scout's body," Signe breathed. "Tracked us from there." Magnus had dismounted and was examining the ground with the focused attention of an experienced hunter. Even from their distance, they could see him pointing to various signs, a broken branch here, a footprint there. The man was no pampered lord who left tracking to his men. He was reading their trail with the skill of someone who had spent years hunting both animals and humans. "The cave will hide us for now," Eirik said, "but if he searches systematically, he'll find the entrance eventually. Then we need to leave, now while we still can. There's nowhere to run. He has horses, and we're on foot, in open ground. They'll run us down within an hour." Signe watched Magnus direct his men to spread out, beginning a methodical search of the area. "Then what do you suggest?" Eirik's mind raced through possibilities, each one more desperate than the last. They could try to wait out the search, hoping Magnus would move on, but the Jarl seemed determined to scour every inch of the valley. They could attempt to slip away during the night, but Magnus would likely post guards and resume the hunt at first light, or they could take the initiative. "How well do you know Magnus's fighting style?" Eirik asked. "What do you mean? In battle, how does he prefer to fight? Does he lead from the front or hang back and command? Is he overconfident or cautious?" Signe frowned, trying to understand where his thoughts were leading. "He's proud, likes to be seen as the strongest warrior in any group, but he's not stupid. He wouldn't take unnecessary risks unless his reputation demanded it." "And his men, are they loyal through fear or respect?" "Fear, mostly, and greed. He pays well, but I've heard grumbling about his increasingly erratic behavior. Some of the older warriors remember when he at least pretended to honor the old codes." Eirik nodded, pieces of a desperate plan beginning to form in his mind. "If we could separate him from his men, make him choose between his pride and his safety." "You're thinking of challenging him to single combat?" Signe's voice rose slightly in alarm. "Eirik, he's 20 years younger than you and has been fighting continuously while you've been chopping wood in exile." "Perhaps, but I have advantages he doesn't know about." Erik's hand went instinctively to his sword hilt, and sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted if the prey refuses to run. Before Signe could protest further, a shout echoed across the valley. One of Magnus's men had found something. Probably more signs of their passage. The search was tightening like a noose, and soon there would be nowhere left to hide. "There's something else to consider," Eirik said quietly, "even if we escape. Today, tomorrow will bring the same hunt, and the day after that. Magnus will not stop until you're dead or back in chains. At some point, we have to stop running and start fighting." Signe watched the searchers moving closer to their hiding place, her green eyes reflecting the same calculation that drove Eirik's planning. "What exactly are you proposing?" "We turn the tables. Instead of being prey, we become predators. Hit them when they don't expect it, thin their numbers, force Magnus to fight on our terms instead of his. That's madness. We're 2 people against 8. 2 people who know this terrain better than they do. 2 people who have nothing left to lose and everything to fight for." Eirik met her eyes, seeing his own desperate determination reflected. "There, your father was a warrior. What would he have done in our situation?" The question hung between them as another shout rang out, closer this time. Magnus's voice carried clearly across the valley, harsh with authority and anger. He was directing his men to search every cave, every crevice, every possible hiding place. Signe closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, something had changed. The frightened thrall was gone, replaced by someone who carried the blood of Jarls and the fire of righteous fury. "My father would have made them pay for every step," she said quietly. "He would have reminded them that hunting a wolf in its own den is dangerous work. Then that's what we do. We stop being rabbits and remember how to be wolves." Outside their cave, Magnus's voice grew louder as he approached, and Eirik could hear the confidence in his tone, the certainty of a predator closing in on wounded prey. But confidence, Eirik knew from long experience, could be a warrior's greatest weakness. The stone cooking pot sat cooling by their small fire, the shared meal within growing cold as they prepared for what might be their final battle. But it had served its purpose, nourishing them both for the fight ahead and symbolizing the partnership that had grown between 2 damaged souls who had found something worth protecting in each other. Soon, Magnus would learn what it meant to hunt those who refused to remain prey. The wool blanket that had once been Signe's only protection against the winter night now lay spread between them as they huddled close for warmth in the deeper recesses of the cave. Eirik had mended it carefully during their journey, his large fingers surprisingly deft with needle and thread. Another skill learned from his mother, another gentle art that had survived his years of violence. They had been forced to retreat deeper into the cave system as Magnus's search intensified. The Jarl had found their original hiding place, his fury evident in the way he'd ordered his men to tear apart their abandoned campsite. Now they waited in near total darkness, listening to the echo of voices and the scrape of boots on stone as the searchers explored the outer chambers. "He's persistent," Signe whispered, her breath warm against Eirik's ear as they pressed close. Together, beneath the blanket. "More than I expected. Wounded pride makes men do foolish things," Eirik replied quietly. "He came himself instead of sending subordinates because you damaged more than just his flesh when you cut him. You wounded his reputation." The intimacy of their hiding place, forced together by necessity, sharing breath and warmth in the darkness, had awakened something neither had expected to feel again. For Signe, it was the first time in years that a man's proximity brought comfort rather than fear. For Eirik, it was a reminder that his capacity for tenderness had not died with his family. "Tell me about her," Signe said softly. "Your wife. What was she like?" Eirik was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of carefully preserved memories. Astrid was like sunlight on water, bright, warm, always in motion. She could make anyone laugh, even old warriors who thought they'd forgotten how. She saw good in everyone, even in me during my darkest moods. He paused, lost in recollection. "She would have liked you, I think. She always said that strength came in many forms, and yours would have impressed her. I wish I could have met her. She would have fussed over your injuries, fed you until you couldn't eat another bite, then sat you down and demanded to hear every detail of your story." A ghost of a smile touched his lips in the darkness. "She collected strays, wounded animals, lost travelers, anyone who needed help. Our house was always full of her rescued creatures." Signe shifted closer, her hand finding his in the darkness. "She sounds wonderful." She was. And she deserved better than to die alone while her husband was off playing at being a merchant. The old guilt crept into his voice. "If I had been there, you would have died with her, and that would have served no one." Signe's fingers intertwined with his. "Guilt is a luxury we can't afford. The dead don't want our suffering. They want us to live well, to honor their memory through our choices." From deeper in the cave system came the sound of Magnus's voice, harsh with frustration. He was growing impatient with the search, but not yet ready to abandon it. They had hours yet before safety, assuming they could remain undiscovered. "What about you?" Eirik asked. "Was there ever someone who made you think of marriage, of building a life?" "Before my captivity, there was a young man, Halfdan Eriksson, distantly related to my father. He was kind, gentle, nothing like the warriors who usually courted jarls' daughters. He wrote poetry, if you can imagine such a thing." Her voice grew wistful. "I used to think that perhaps love could grow between us, given time." "What happened to him?" "Killed in one of Magnus's early raids, along with most of the young men of his generation. Magnus was very thorough in eliminating potential opposition." Bitterness crept into her tone. "I sometimes wonder if I would have been a different person. If he had lived, if we had married, if my children had grown up in peace. Do you regret the path that led you here?" Signe considered the question, acutely aware of Eirik's warmth beside her, of the strange comfort she found in his presence, despite the danger surrounding them. "I regret the suffering, the loss, the years of degradation. But this moment, here, with you, fighting for something that matters, this feels more real than anything I experienced in those comfortable years before the storm." She turned to face him in the darkness, though she could barely make out his features. "Does that make me as broken as you think you are?" "It makes you human." His hand found her cheek, calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "We're both scarred, both damaged by what we've endured. But perhaps that's what allows us to recognize the worth in each other, the moment stretched between them, charged with possibility and the awareness that they might not survive the next few hours. In the darkness, surrounded by enemies, they found themselves drawn together by something stronger than mere survival instinct. "Eirik," she whispered, and he heard in her voice the same longing that had been growing in his own heart. "I know." His thumb traced the line of her cheek. "I feel it too. Is it madness? To find love in the middle of such darkness?" "Perhaps." But what is sanity worth if it means living without hope? He leaned closer, his forehead touching hers. I had resigned myself to dying alone in these woods, forgotten and unmourned. You've given me something I thought was lost forever. Their lips met in the darkness, tentative at first, then with growing urgency as years of loneliness and pain poured out between them. The kiss tasted of desperation and possibility, of two people choosing connection over isolation, despite every reason to guard their hearts. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard, overwhelmed by the intensity of emotion that had been unleashed. Whatever happens, Signe whispered, I'm grateful for this, for you, for the reminder that there's still beauty in the world worth fighting for. And I'm grateful that you came to my door that night, even if it means remembering what it feels like to have something to lose. The voices in the outer caves were growing more distant as Magnus's search moved away from their hiding place. Soon they would have to emerge, to continue their desperate flight or make their stand against overwhelming odds. But for now, they held each other in the darkness, two broken souls who had found something whole in their union. The wool blanket that had once symbolized Signe's desperate flight now covered them both, transformed from a symbol of desperation into one of shared intimacy and hope. Beneath its mended folds, they discovered that even in the midst of danger and uncertainty, the human heart could still choose love over fear, connection over isolation. Outside, Magnus might be hunting them with the patience of a predator and the fury of a wounded tyrant. But here in the darkness, they had found something he could never touch, the recognition that they were no longer alone, no longer merely surviving, but truly living for the first time in years. When morning came, they would face whatever trials awaited them together, strengthened by the bond they had forged in the depths of the earth and the depths of their shared need for redemption. The gold arm ring caught the morning light like trapped fire, its intricate engravings telling a story that Signe had hidden. For 3 days of growing intimacy and shared danger, she turned it slowly in her fingers, watching Eirik's expression change from confusion to understanding, to something that might have been betrayal. It was my mother's, she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of a truth too long concealed. Given to her by my father when I was born, the only thing of value I managed to keep when Magnus took me captive. Eirik stared at the ring, recognition dawning in his pale eyes. The craftsmanship was unmistakable, not the work of some village goldsmith, but the creation of a master artisan commissioned for royalty. More telling still were the runes worked into the gold, spelling out a name that made his blood run cold. Eirik's daughter, he read aloud, but not just any Eirik. No! Signe's hands shook as she held the ring, the last tangible connection to her true heritage. Eirik Grimson the Bold, Jarl of the Western Reaches, son of Grim the Giant Killer, descendant of kings. The full weight of her revelation hit Eirik like a physical blow. He had known she was noble-born, known her father was a Jarl, but this changed everything. Eirik Grimson's lineage could be traced back to the legendary kings of old, to the heroes sung about in the greatest sagas. His daughter was not just the heir to lands and wealth, but to a claim that could shake the foundations of the political order throughout the Northlands. You are of royal blood, he said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. Legitimate royal blood. My great-grandfather was Harold the Wolf, who held the high throne before the kingdoms fractured. My father's claim to those lands was stronger than Magnus could ever imagine. Signe's voice grew steadier as she spoke the truth she had hidden even from herself. I am not just a Jarl's daughter, Eirik. I am the last of a line that once ruled all these territories. Eirik stood and began pacing the small confines of their cave, his mind racing through the implications. If Signe's heritage became known, Every ambitious jarl in the region would want either to claim her as wife or eliminate her as a threat. Magnus's desperate pursuit suddenly made perfect sense. He wasn't just hunting a runaway thrall who could expose his treachery. He was hunting someone whose very existence challenged his right to rule. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" he asked, though he thought he knew the answer. "Because I wanted to forget it." Tears began to flow down her cheeks, not from fear, but from the pain of carrying such a burden alone. "For 3 years, I told myself I was just Signe the thrall, just another broken woman trying to survive. It was easier than remembering what I had lost, what I was supposed to be. And now I realized that forgetting was another kind of death. My father didn't just die that night. I killed him again every day I denied who I was, every time I let Magnus's lies define my worth." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and when she looked at Eirik again, there was steel in her. "I gaze. I am Signe Eriksdottir, daughter of kings, rightful heir to the western reaches, and I will no longer hide from that truth." The transformation was remarkable to witness. The frightened woman who had stumbled to his door was gone, replaced by someone who carried herself with the unconscious authority of generations of rulers. Even in her borrowed clothes, dirty and torn from their flight, she suddenly looked every inch the princess she had been born to be. "This changes everything," Eirik said, though he was still processing the full scope of what she had revealed. "Yes, it does. Magnus isn't just a murderous usurper. He's a rebel against the legitimate crown. Every jarl who has sworn fealty to him and every warrior who serves in his army, they're all oath breakers by ancient law." Signe's voice carried a conviction that had been absent before. "If I can prove my identity, if I can gather supporters, you could claim not just your father's lands, but the high throne itself," Eirik finished. "You could unite the fractured kingdoms under legitimate rule. Or I could die attempting it, leaving Magnus free to continue his expansion unchecked." She looked at the arm ring again, then slipped it onto her finger where it belonged. "But at least I would die as myself, not as the broken thing he tried to make me." Eirik felt something shift inside his chest, not the desperate protectiveness that had driven him to defend her, but something deeper and more complex. He was no longer harboring a refugee or even helping a wronged noblewoman seek justice. He was in the presence of a queen, whether she claimed the title or not. "There's something else," Signe continued, her voice growing uncertain again. "About us, about what's growing between us. If I reclaim my birthright, a queen cannot marry a broken-down exile," Eirik said quietly, voicing what they both understood. "The political implications alone would be impossible. I don't care about the politics." The fierce determination in her voice surprised them both. "I care about you, about what we've found together. I won't let duty steal that from me the way it stole everything else. And I won't let my feelings for you cloud my judgment about what's best for the kingdoms." Eirik's voice was gentle but firm. "If you truly are the rightful heir, then you have obligations that go beyond personal happiness." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching their hiding place. Magnus had returned with reinforcements. Eirik could hear at least 20 horses, possibly more. The Jarl had clearly decided that subtlety was no longer necessary. "He's brought an army," Signe observed, peering through the cave entrance, "because he knows what you represent now. Someone must have recognized you, or perhaps he's always known and was simply hoping to keep it quiet." Eirik began checking his weapons with practiced efficiency. "A royal claimant cannot be allowed to escape. Too much depends on your silence. Then we make sure our voices are heard before he silences them." Signe's hand went to the seax knife he had given her, her grip confident despite her lack of formal training. "If I die today, I die as Princess Signe Eriksdottir, not as a nameless thrall. You're not going to die today." The promise came out with such conviction that Signe felt her heart lift despite their desperate circumstances. "Not while I draw your breath." "Why?" she asked. "Why would you risk everything for me? You barely knew my true identity until moments ago." Eirik considered the question as Magnus's voice carried across the valley, harsh with authority, as he deployed his men. Why indeed? Was it love, still fragile and new? Was it the desire for redemption through service to a just cause? Or was it something simpler and more primal, the recognition that some things were worth dying for? Because you're not just a queen, he said finally. You're the queen who came to my door in need, who shared my fire and my food, who saw past the monster. I'd been to the man I might still become. He met her eyes, seeing his own reflection in their green depths. Whatever titles you claim, whatever crown you might wear, you'll always be the woman who reminded me that love was stronger than isolation. Outside, Magnus's army was taking position, preparing for what would likely be their final assault. But inside the cave, two people who had found each other against all odds prepared to face whatever came next. Their bond forged stronger by truth rather than weakened by deception. The gold arm ring gleamed on Signe's finger as she gripped her weapon, a symbol not just of her royal heritage, but of her refusal to hide any longer from who she was meant to be. Whatever happened in the next few hours, she would face it as herself, princess, queen, and the woman who had fallen in love with a broken warrior in the depths of winter woods. The game had changed completely, and Magnus was about to learn that he was no longer hunting a frightened thrall, but a queen who had found her courage and a champion willing to die for her crown. The sharpening stone sang against steel as Eirik drew his blade across its surface with methodical precision. Each stroke was deliberate, measured, bringing his weapons back to the razor edge they had once maintained when he was feared throughout the Northlands. The rhythmic scraping filled the cave like a warrior's meditation, each pass of the stone erasing another year of rust and neglect. Your sword remembers, Signe observed, watching him work, even after all these years in exile. Steel has a long memory, Eirik replied, testing the edge with his thumb and finding it satisfactory. Longer than flesh sometimes. This blade has drunk the blood of kings and peasants alike. Though I pray today, it serves justice rather than mere vengeance. The morning light revealed the full scope of Magnus's force arrayed against them, at least 30 men, all mounted and armed for war rather than pursuit. The Jarl had clearly decided that subtlety was no longer an option. He meant to end this hunt with overwhelming force, regardless of who might witness the slaughter. He's not taking any chances, Signe said, studying their enemies through the concealed cave entrance. That's a war band, not a search party, which tells us how seriously he takes the threat you represent. Eirik moved to his axe, running the stone along its curved edge with the same careful attention. A princess with a legitimate claim to the throne cannot be allowed to escape, even if it means revealing his hand to any observers. They had spent the pre-dawn hours in preparation, both physical and mental. Eirik had shared everything he knew about tactics and combat, while Signe had detailed every weakness she had observed in Magnus's character and methods during her years of captivity. It was a crash course in warfare for her, and a return to old ways of thinking for him. Tell me again about his sword work, Eirik said, switching to his seax knife. How does he favor his attacks? He likes to overwhelm opponents with brute strength rather than finesse. His reach is longer than most men's, and he uses that advantage to keep enemies at a distance where his power can tell. Signe demonstrated with her own blade, showing the aggressive chopping style she had observed. But he's gotten careless over the years, used to facing opponents who are already beaten before the fight begins. Arrogance can be useful. A man who expects easy victory doesn't prepare for a real fight. The knife's edge gleamed as Eirik finished his work. What about his men? Will they fight to the death for him? Or are they mercenaries who'll flee if the tide turns? Mixed loyalties. Some are true believers who share his vision of conquest. Others are just there for the plunder and will scatter if things go badly. Signe's knowledge was detailed, born from 3 years of careful observation. The younger ones are eager to prove themselves, but the veterans are more cautious. They've seen too many battles to waste their lives unnecessarily, Eirik nodded, filing away each detail. In his prime, he had been known as much for his tactical mind as his sword arm. Battles were won before the first blow was struck, through preparation, positioning, and understanding your enemy better than he understood himself. "There's something else we need to discuss," he said, setting aside his weapons, "the possibility that we might not survive this." Signe met his eyes without flinching. "I've been thinking about that as well. If I fall, if you somehow escape, you must find a way to reach King Olaf in the Eastern Kingdoms. He knew your father, respected him. With the arm ring as proof of your identity, I won't leave you to die alone." Her voice carried the same steel as the weapons he had been sharpening. "We stand together, or not at all. Listen to me." Eirik took her hands in his, feeling the calluses that years of hard labor had left on her palms. "You are not just a woman anymore. You are a symbol, a hope for legitimate rule in a time of chaos. Your life matters more than mine. My life has no meaning without the people who give it purpose." She squeezed his hands tightly. "I spent 3 years learning to survive by any means necessary. I won't go back to that existence, even if it means living longer." The depth of her conviction struck him like a physical blow. Here was someone who had endured years of degradation and abuse, who had every reason to choose life over principle. Yet she was willing to die, rather than abandon the man who had shown her love. "You've changed," he said softly, from the frightened woman who came to my door to someone who could truly be a queen. You changed me, your belief in me, your willingness to see past what Magnus tried to make me, that gave me back myself." She leaned forward and kissed him gently, a benediction, rather than passion. "Whatever happens today, I want you to know that loving you has been the truest thing I've felt in years." Outside, they could hear Magnus's voice carrying across the valley as he organized his men. The Jarl was taking no chances, positioning archers on the high ground, sending scouts to block any possible escape routes. It was a textbook siege approach, designed to crush any resistance through sheer force of numbers. "He's giving us no choice. But to make our stand here," Eirik observed. "The cave system is defensible, but there's only one way out. Perhaps that's not entirely disadvantageous." Signe's tactical thinking had improved dramatically over their days together. "If we can draw them into the narrow passages, their numbers become less important." "True, but it also means we can't retreat if things go badly." Eirik checked his armor. Simple leather reinforced with iron rings, adequate for their purposes. "Once we commit to this fight, we see it through to the end. And then let's make sure the end is one we can live with." Signe had donned the mail shirt Eirik had given her, cinched tight around her smaller frame, but providing decent protection. "If I'm going to die as a princess, I might as well fight like one." The morning sun climbed higher, and with it came the inevitable approach of Magnus's forces. They could hear the jingle of mail, the scrape of weapons being drawn, the low murmur of men preparing for battle. The hunt was ending, and the real fight was about to begin. "There's one more thing," Eirik said, pulling out a small object wrapped in leather. "I want you to have this." He unwrapped his mother's prayer beads, the same ones he had clutched through 10 years of exile and self-recrimination. The wooden spheres seemed to glow in the cave's dim light, worn smooth by countless hours of anxious handling. "They helped me remember who I was before the darkness took me," he said, placing them in her hands. "Perhaps they'll help you remember who you are when the fighting starts." Signe looked at the simple beads, understanding the magnitude of what he was offering. These represented his last connection to the man he had been, before grief transformed him into a monster. His anchor to the possibility of redemption. "I can't take these. They're too important to you. They're important to me because they represent hope. And you've become my hope, Signe. Knowing that you might survive, that you might reclaim your throne and bring justice to these lands. That's worth more than any personal talisman." She closed her fingers around the beads, feeling their familiar. "Wait, then I'll carry them for both of us, and if we survive this, I'll give them back so we can pray together for better days." "If we survive this," Eirik agreed. Though they both knew the odds were heavily against them, Magnus's voice rose in command, and suddenly the approach began in earnest. Footsteps echoed through the outer chambers of the cave system as his warriors began their advance. The final confrontation was at hand, and with it the test of everything they had discovered about themselves and each other. Eirik hefted his battle-axe, feeling the familiar balance that had once made him legendary. Beside him, Signe gripped her seax with determination that would have made her royal ancestors proud. They stood together at the threshold between their old lives and whatever fate awaited them, two people who had found love in the darkness and were prepared to fight for the light. The sharpening stone had done its work. The weapons were ready. The warriors were prepared, and the moment of truth had finally arrived. Whether they emerged as victors or fell as martyrs, they would face their destiny together, united by bonds stronger than blood or crown, or the bitter weight of the past. Magnus was coming, and Eirik Thorsson was ready to remind the world what it meant to face a true warrior in defense of what he held most dear. The war horn's deep voice echoed through the cave system like the call of some primordial beast, announcing the return of Eirik Thorsson to the world of war. He had blown it from the deepest chamber, the sound carrying through stone passages and out into the valley where Magnus waited with his army. It was a declaration, a challenge, and a promise all in one thunderous note. "Let them come to us," Eirik said, setting the horn aside and taking up his axe. "Let them learn what it means to hunt a wolf in his own den." The horn had served its purpose. Now Magnus knew exactly where they were, but more importantly, he knew that his quarry had chosen to make a stand rather than continue running. The psychological impact was immediate and intended. Instead of pursuing frightened fugitives, his men would now have to assault a prepared position, defended by someone confident enough to announce his presence. Signe positioned herself at Eirik's side, her seax gleaming in the torchlight they had prepared. The narrow passage that led to their chamber could only admit 2 men abreast, forcing Magnus's numerical advantage into irrelevance. Here, skill and determination would matter more than numbers. "Remember," Eirik said quietly, "the first ones through will be his best fighters. They'll test our defenses, probe for weaknesses. After that, we kill them all," Signe finished, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they faced. The first sounds of approach came as expected, the scrape of mail against stone, the whispered commands of men moving through unfamiliar terrain. Magnus was being cautious, sending scouts ahead to map the cave system before committing his main force. A figure appeared at the passage entrance, young, eager, probably hoping to win glory by being first into the fight. Eirik let him advance 3 steps into the chamber before the throwing axe took him in the chest, the impact driving him back into the passage where his body would hamper those behind. "One," Eirik said calmly, retrieving a backup weapon. The psychological warfare was as important as the physical. Every man Magnus lost would make the others more cautious, more afraid. Fear was a weapon as sharp as any blade, and Eirik intended to wield it expertly. 2 more warriors rushed the entrance together, trying to overwhelm through speed and aggression. These were veterans, their movements coordinated and professional, but the confined space worked against them. Eirik's axe swept in a horizontal arc that caught the first man across the throat, while Signe's blade found the gap in the second man's armor, sliding between ribs to find his heart. 3, Signe said, pulling her weapon free with practiced efficiency. From the passage came Magnus's roar of frustration. He had expected to find cowering fugitives, not prepared defenders who fought with the skill of seasoned warriors. His voice carried clearly as he berated his men for their caution. "He's angry," Signe observed. "Good. Angry men make mistakes." The next assault came with more organization, a shield wall of 4 men advancing in formation, their overlapping protection designed to negate the advantage of the narrow space. But Eirik had faced such tactics before, in battles that had become the stuff of legend. He met their charge head-on, his axe work a deadly dance of precision and power. The confined space that helped his enemies' coordination also limited their ability to maneuver. When the first shield cracked under his assault, the entire formation began to collapse. Signe struck from the side, her smaller size allowing her to slip past their guard and strike at ankles and knees, crippling rather than killing, but removing threats just as effectively. When the dust settled, 4 more bodies clogged the passage, and Magnus's frustrated commands echoed from the outer chambers. His best men were falling to 2 defenders, and his reputation was suffering with every failed assault. 7, Eirik counted, breathing hard, but still steady. How many more will he sacrifice before he realizes this isn't working? Signe asked, wiping blood from her blade. Pride will drive him to try again, but he's running out of men willing to lead the charge. Eirik listened to the voices from the passage, noting the fear creeping into the warriors' tones. The next assault will be different. Desperation makes men either cowards or heroes. They didn't have to wait long. Magnus himself appeared at the passage entrance, his massive frame filling the opening, his eyes burning with the fury of a man whose authority had been challenged too many times. Behind him came his remaining warriors, but these were his personal guard, the men who had sworn blood oaths to die for their lord. "Eirik Thorsson!" Magnus's voice boomed through the chamber. "I know who you are now, the phantom of the northern reaches, the man who burned Saxon villages for sport. Do you think your reputation frightens me?" "I think," Eirik replied calmly, hefting his axe, "that you've confused me with the monster I used to be. Today you face the man I've chosen to become." The war horn lay silent now, its work done. It had announced the return of a legend, but more than that, it had proclaimed the birth of something new, a warrior who fought not from rage or greed, but from love and the desire to protect what mattered most. Magnus raised his sword, and behind him, his remaining men prepared for what they all knew would be the final assault. The narrow passage that had protected Eirik and Signe would soon be filled with the desperate fury of cornered predators. But for the first time in 10 years, Eirik Thorsson was exactly where he belonged, standing between evil and innocence, ready to prove that redemption was written in deeds rather than words. The inherited sword felt like destiny in Signe's hands as she pulled it from Magnus's fallen champion, its blade still gleaming with the blood of the man who had wielded it. Against her father. This was Blooddrinker, the ancient weapon that had been passed down through her father's line for generations, stolen along with everything else when Magnus murdered her family. "Father," she whispered, feeling the perfect balance of the weapon, the way it seemed to sing as it cut through the air. "Your daughter remembers." The final confrontation had come down to this. Magnus, bloodied but still standing, facing Eirik. Across a chamber now littered with the bodies of his men. The Jarl's personal guard had fought with desperate courage, but skill and tactics had prevailed over numbers. Now only the 2 champions remained, circling each other like wolves, each seeking the opening that would end this long hunt. "You fight well for a man who has spent 10 years hiding in the forest," Magnus said, his sword weaving hypnotic patterns in the torchlight. "But age and exile have made you soft, Thorsson. You are not the terror you once were." "No," Eirik agreed, his axe steady in his hands. "I am something better." They came together in a clash of steel that rang through the stone chamber like thunder. Magnus was younger, stronger, driven by rage and desperation. But Eirik fought with the calm precision of a man who had nothing left to prove and everything to protect. Each exchange of blows was measured, controlled, building toward an inevitable conclusion. Signe watched for her moment, Blooddrinker ready in her grip. This was not Eirik's fight alone. Magnus had taken her father, her home, her very identity. Justice demanded that she play a role in his downfall. The duel raged across the chamber, neither man giving ground, both bleeding from minor wounds. Magnus fought with the brutal efficiency that had made him feared throughout the Northlands, but there was something desperate in his attacks now, a recognition that his entire empire hung in the balance of this single combat. "You cannot win," he snarled, driving Eirik back with a series of powerful strokes. "Even if you kill me, my men will hunt down your princess. She will die screaming, and all of this will have been for nothing." "Your men are dead," Eirik replied calmly, sidestepping a thrust that would have opened his throat. "And she is not my princess. She is your queen." The words hit Magnus like a physical blow. Until this moment, he had still thought of Signe as a valuable prisoner, a witness to be silenced. The full reality of her royal blood, of what her survival meant to his stolen kingdom, struck him with devastating clarity. In that moment of distraction, Eirik struck. His axe caught Magnus across the shoulder, spinning the bigger man around, and sending his sword flying. The Jarl stumbled off balance, blood flowing from the wound, but it was Signe who stepped forward to finish it. "Magnus Bloodaxe," she said, her voice carrying the authority of generations of rulers. "You murdered my father under his own roof, stole his lands, enslaved his daughter. You are guilty of treason against the crown, violation of the sacred laws, of hospitality, and crimes against the innocent." Magnus looked up at her from his knees, seeing not the broken thrall he had tormented for 3 years, but the princess she had always been beneath his cruelty. "You are nothing," he gasped, "a bastard's daughter with delusions of grandeur. I am Signe Eriksdottir, daughter of Eirik Grimson the Bold, heir to the throne of the Western Reaches." She raised Blooddrinker, its blade catching the light. "And I sentence you to death." "Wait!" Magnus raised a hand, desperation creeping into his voice. "You need me alive. My Jarls will not accept your claim without proof. Let me live, and I will acknowledge your right to rule." Signe paused, the sword still raised. For a moment, Eirik thought she might actually consider the offer. The practical advantages were obvious. Magnus's public acknowledgement would legitimize her claim in ways that no amount of royal blood could achieve. "You would do that?" she asked. "Publicly acknowledge my right to rule?" "Yes. Yes, I swear it." "By the gods, you are the rightful heir. I was wrong to—" Blooddrinker descended in a perfect arc, taking Magnus's head from his shoulders in a single, clean stroke. The Jarl's eyes went wide with shock in the moment before death claimed him, as if he couldn't quite believe that his silver tongue had finally failed him. "My father taught me that some oaths are worthless," Signe said quietly, looking down at the body of her family's murderer. "A man who breaks sacred hospitality will break any vow that serves his purpose." Eirik moved to her side, seeing the tears that flowed down her cheeks, despite the fierce satisfaction in her eyes. "It is done. Justice is served." "It is done," she agreed, lowering the sword that had finally returned to its rightful owner. "But now the real work begins." In reclaiming Blooddrinker, Signe had reclaimed more than just a weapon. She had reclaimed her identity, her purpose, and her birthright. The broken thrall was gone forever, replaced by someone who could truly wear a crown. The chamber fell silent except for the sound of their breathing and the distant echo of wind through stone passages. The hunt was over, the hunter was dead, and Princess Signe Eriksdottir was ready to become the queen her people needed. The wedding rings gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, simple bands forged from metal reclaimed from Magnus's own sword. A fitting transformation of an instrument of tyranny into symbols of love and hope. Eirik had crafted them himself during the weeks following their victory, working the steel with the same careful attention he had once given to weapons of war. "Are you certain?" Signe asked, though the question was ritual by now, asked and answered. Countless times since Magnus's death, a queen could choose any husband in the known world. You don't have to bind yourself to a broken exile. And a man could choose to live safely in isolation rather than face the challenges of helping to rebuild a kingdom, Eirik replied, slipping the ring onto her finger with gentle precision. We are both choosing the harder path, but we're choosing it together. 6 months had passed since that desperate battle in the cave, and the world had changed dramatically. Word of Magnus's death and Signe's survival had spread like wildfire through the northern kingdoms. Some jarls had immediately declared their loyalty to the rightful heir, eager to be on the winning side of history. Others had resisted, leading to a series of smaller conflicts that tested both Signe's claim and her resolve. But she had proven herself worthy of the crown in ways that went beyond bloodline. Her first act as queen had been to free all thralls in the territories under her control, offering them the choice of paid service or freedom to seek their fortunes elsewhere. Her second had been to establish new laws, protecting the weak from the predations of the powerful. Magnus's reign of fear was replaced by something that hadn't been seen in generations. The rule of law applied equally to all. The people love you, Eirik observed, watching through the window of their temporary residence as crowds gathered in the courtyard below. Not just because you're the rightful ruler, but because you've proven yourself worthy of their trust. They love us, Signe corrected, taking his hand. A queen is only as strong as her advisors, and you've become indispensable to the process of rebuilding. It was true. Eirik's years of exile had given him a perspective that proved invaluable. In governance, he understood the struggles of common folk in ways that most nobles never could, and his strategic mind, once devoted to warfare, had found new purpose in the complexities of statecraft. He had become her most trusted counselor, the one person whose advice carried no hidden agenda. "There's something I want to show you," Signe said, leading him to a table where maps and documents lay scattered. The final reports from the Eastern. In territories, the last of Magnus's loyalists had been defeated only days before. Their leader, a brutal man named Ivar the Cruel, finally brought to justice for his crimes against innocent villagers. With his fall, Signe's authority now extended throughout the traditional boundaries of her father's kingdom, and beyond into lands that had been conquered through Magnus's treachery. "It's finished?" Eirik asked, studying the reports. "The fighting is finished. The real work is just beginning." Signe traced boundaries on the map with her finger. Rebuilding burned villages, establishing new trade routes, creating a system of justice that people can trust. It will take years, maybe decades. "And you're prepared for that challenge?" "We are prepared for it," she said again, emphasizing the plural. "I cannot do this alone, Eirik. I need your strength, your wisdom, your love to sustain me through what's coming." From the courtyard came the sound of celebration. Music, laughter, the voices of people who had reason to hope for. The first time in years. The royal wedding was to take place in 3 days, a public ceremony that would unite not just two people, but symbolize the rebirth of legitimate rule. "Do you ever miss it?" Signe asked quietly. "The simplicity of your exile, the peace of having no responsibilities beyond your own survival?" Eirik considered the question as he had many times over the months. The cabin in the woods seemed like a dream now, a half-remembered sanctuary from a different life. Sometimes, in the midst of dealing with petty nobles and complex policy decisions, he did feel a twinge of nostalgia for those quiet years. "I miss the silence," he admitted, "but I don't miss the emptiness. Solitude and peace are not the same thing, and I've learned that true peace comes from purpose, not isolation." "And do you think we can find that? Purpose together, I mean." "I think we've already found it." He gestured toward the window, where their people went about their daily lives with hope instead of fear. Every child who grows up free instead of enslaved, every village that prospers instead of being burned for another man's ambition, that's our purpose, our legacy. Signe moved to the window, looking out at the kingdom they were building together. "My father would be proud, I think, not just of reclaiming his throne, but of what we're trying to do with it. He would be proud of the woman you've become, not despite your suffering, but because of how you've transformed it into wisdom and compassion." The wedding rings caught the light again as Signe held up her hand, admiring the simple beauty of the banns that would soon make their union official. But the real ceremony had already taken place months ago, in a cave where two broken people had chosen to trust each other with their deepest fears and greatest hopes. "Tell me about the future," she said, leaning back against his chest as they watched their people preparing for celebration. "What do you see when you imagine years from now?" "I see children, ours and others, playing safely in courtyards that were once filled with fear. I see trade ships arriving with goods from distant lands, bringing prosperity instead of raiders. I see old men and women dying peacefully in their beds, knowing their grandchildren will inherit a better world." He paused, then added quietly, "And I see us, grown old together, still working side by side to make that vision real." "Promise me," Signe whispered. "Promise me that we'll never forget what it felt like to have nothing, so we'll never take for granted what we're building." "I promise," Eirik said, sealing the vow with a kiss that tasted of hope and determination. Outside, the sun began to set over a kingdom finally at peace, its light reflecting off the rings that would soon unite a warrior and a queen in bonds stronger than any crown or sword. They had found each other in the depths of winter and despair, and together they had forged something that would endure long after their own stories had become legend. The broken exile and the enslaved princess were gone forever, replaced by partners who had learned that love, when combined with purpose, could indeed change the world.